Good evening. We're starting this special program tonight. I call it Light Over Darkness. Light Over Darkness, celebration of light in the midst of darkness, in the midst of winter. And we're going to light the menorah. We're going to light the Chanukah tomorrow night. Most appropriate time to think about light and the power that light has in it, and the power that light carries on all of us. And this very special session is dedicated to a good cause, and whoever's watching us is taking part in a double mitzvah. First of all, we study Torah together, but also there is a good cause involved, and that's refuah shlema, speedy recovery of Larissa Fortel. Her Hebrew name is Leah Chaya Bas Chava. So let's keep this in mind, that we're doing a great mitzvah right now just by taking part in this Torah study. And of course we know taking part in the Torah study by itself is a great mitzvah, but this specific one is also having a dedication. And so the merit of our Torah study will go to refuah shlema, the speedy recovery of Larissa, of Leah Chaya Bas Chava. Refuah shlema. So my friends, we're about to celebrate Hanukkah. And this year, Hanukkah always falls in winter months. It's always in the midst of darkness that we lit the Chanukah menorah. But this year specifically, there's darkness of pandemic around us. There's a lot of gloom. There's a lot of all sorts of negative energies that we associate with choshech, with darkness. And it's most appropriate time now to talk about how we bring more light into the world. And we're going to discuss the familiar story of Hanukkah from somewhat different angles. We're going to take a look at the history of the holiday, and we're going to discover how this holiday itself transformed with times and how it became what it is now, the celebration of a spiritual victory of light over darkness. We will also take a look at a very important distinction and difference between the two cultures that clashed in the story of Hanukkah. That's the culture of the Greeks, of course, and the Jewish culture. And finally, at the end of this presentation, we will be hopefully giving some practical advice to each of you on how to bring more light into our lives. So let's start from the very beginning. First of all, what is Hanukkah? Of course, we're all familiar with the most important commandment, with the most important mitzvah of Hanukkah, to lit the menorah. We start with one on the right side, and eventually we add every day more and more lights until we reach the magic number, the mystical number of 8. 8, of course, is the number of the supernatural. 7 is the number of fullness. It's the number of days of the week. 8, which goes beyond 7, is the number of the supernatural. So we reach that supernatural ability of bringing light into the world. We reach that state of miracle, of fullness, of completion. So that's a beautiful, beautiful understanding of what Hanukkah is. However, it's important to understand historically that Hanukkah itself is a holiday that had many different meanings, and it all went quite a bit of a transformation. So if we take a look at one of the earlier sources, we're going to see for instance, in Josephus. Of course, Josephus Flavius was an important Jewish historian, one of the best known Jewish historians of the time. He wrote around the time of the destruction of the temple, and he wrote the book Antiquities of the Jews, where he describes Jewish customs. So it's a very valuable source for us to understand how Jews celebrated different holidays and how Judaism, what Judaism actually was in those days. And by the way, he wrote this as other his books he wrote in Greek, which was of course the language of vernacular like English is today. So he actually is the first one to call this holiday of lights, but not for the reason you think about. You would probably assume that it's a holiday of lights because of celebration of the miracle and us lighting the candles of the menorah. But he says it's the holiday of lights because it was the holiday, and the meaning of the holiday Chanukah, by the way, Chanukah stands for renewal, rededication, because after the victorious campaign of the Maccabees, after Maccabean revolt against the Greek oppressors, they finally liberated the temple and they rededicated the temple. And that's the meaning of the holiday Chanukah. Chanukah means rededication, renewal. They lit the menorah. And this became the symbol of the holiday, and that's basically what Josephus writes in context of the holiday Chanukah, that the main idea of the holiday was rededication of the temple and all the miracles associated with it. If we take a look at the Siddur, we have an insert on Hanukkah, what we say in our prayers. We're going to start saying that tomorrow night when the holiday starts. We're going to see that the main emphasis on a miracle from the perspective of the Siddur, what our rabbis instituted for us to say, what are we actually celebrating? They're saying it's the miraculous victory of a very few over many. Of course, in the modern day culture, we're all fascinated with numbers, and usually numbers are what count. But here, miraculously, very few Jewish partisans overtook the strong army of the Greeks, of the Seleucids, and the pure over the impure. Again, Jews being the ones motivated by the desire to restore Jewish sovereignty, to restore and rededicate the temple. And finally, the rededication of the temple is being described. It came into the temple, rededicated it. No mentioning of so familiar story of the jug of oil. That, my friends, would come later. We don't find it neither in the Siddur nor in Josephus, not even in the book of the Maccabees. And the book of the Maccabees, of course, is the book that didn't make it into Tanakh, but one can read it as a historical book, as a historical record of what happened, which to a large extent is telling us all the miracles of many victories that happened in those wars between us and the Greeks. So it appears from the early sources, two main reasons to celebrate were, first, rededication of the temple, and second reason was the idea that we restored our sovereignty and we managed to overcome the foreign invaders, the Greeks. These were the two most important themes. But later in our history, we're going to see a significant change. And that change comes, of course, with the events that would happen later. We know after a brief period of restored sovereignty, Hasmonean kings, and they by themselves actually were not supposed to be kings. They were, as we know, powerful Jewish leaders, but they were the Kohanites. So they were meant to be spiritual leaders, but they became kings, which actually our rabbis were quite critical of. And they got involved in all sorts of intrigues and power games. And as a result, you're going to have a very bitter fight between the brothers. And one of the brothers is going to invite the Romans, is going to invite Pompey. And that's how Romans would make their first step, first encroaching into the land of Judea. And eventually they will use that strength, and eventually they will take the land and will become themselves the masters. And that's how Jewish independence very tragically is going to be lost. Basically, to a large extent, because of this desire of the victors, desire of the descendants of the Hasmoneans, the descendants of the Maccabees, to grab onto the power, and at some point they wouldn't be able to figure it out between themselves. They will get caught into all those, politics, in all those power games, and they themselves will invite their own end, their own demise by inviting the Romans. Very, very tragic. And what's going to happen with the Romans? Of course, we know with the Romans, eventually we're going to have the Great Revolt. And the Great Revolt would lead to the destruction of the temple and would lead to us being in diaspora, being in exile. By the way, if you ever come to Rome, you will be able to see Colosseum. And not many people know, not many people realize that Colosseum was built around the same time the temple was destroyed. Actually, if you take a look, it was built 71 CE, and the temple was destroyed just 1 year earlier. And it's not a legend. To a large extent, it's almost recorded by Roman historians that when you take a look today at the Colosseum, think about millions of our brothers and sisters who got enslaved and taken by the Romans to build in those torturous conditions, to build as slaves, to build that Colosseum. So it's a symbol of Roman pride, and at the same time, for us Jews, it's a reminder of a terrible events of destruction. And what's happening with Hanukkah, you may ask me? Hanukkah, which is the holiday at that point of rededication of the temple, but temple now is lost. There is no more temple. Hanukkah, which is the holiday that celebrates sovereignty, but there is no more sovereignty. Well, Jews would hope to restore the temple for some time after the destruction, and there will be another rebellion, another very powerful rebellion of Bar Kokhba, which will happen actually in 132 CE, just a couple of generations later, and it will be basically with the best Roman legions. It will be suppressed with all the might and the strength of the Roman legions. It will be suppressed and destroyed, and that would be the last nail to the coffin of Jewish sovereignty for centuries. We would not rebel against the Romans again, and there will be a time of great despair. And it will be a time many Jews will be questioning, is there any need, any purpose in celebrating Hanukkah? As a matter of fact, in the Talmud, we're going to find the account of rabbis telling us in some places they stopped celebrating Hanukkah, places like Lod. Today you come to Israel, you come to Ben Gurion International Airport, which is very often called Lod International Airport, right? It's located right next to the city of Lod. In the ancient city of Lod, they stopped celebrating Hanukkah. They said, that's it. We don't have sovereignty. We don't have our temple. It's all lost. It's a distraction. And here at this time, the new understanding of Hanukkah is born. Right at this time of collapse, right at this time of destruction. And that's the great wisdom, of course, of Judaism, of Jewish tradition. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, just passed away recently, says that we, the Jews, we present to the world this idea of hope. We are the civilization of hope. We are the civilization that finds light right in the midst of darkness. So true, said our rabbis, yes, the temple is destroyed, and we don't have the way to restore sovereignty anytime soon. What is that to celebrate about Hanukkah? And at this point, the Talmud is telling us that Hanukkah actually is the celebration of miracle that becomes important throughout the darkest nights of our diaspora, of our galut, and will enlighten us throughout the darkest times of crusades, of all sorts of pogroms and inquisitions and whatnot. Rabbis are telling us that Hanukkah is celebrated for 8 days because of the miracle that happened right in the midst of that great war, right in the midst of that great celebration that was there. But that miracle, my friends, was a hidden miracle. It wasn't known. It wasn't celebrated until its time came. And so that's the miracle that we are so familiar with, finds its place for the first time in the Talmud, when the rabbis are telling us that right in the midst of that great war, they came to rededicate the temple, and they only found one jug of oil. We are familiar with the story, aren't we? And that jug of oil is supposed to last for 1 day, lasted for 8. And of course, my friends, the question would be, okay, it lasted for 8 days, but even naturally it would have lasted 1. So why are we celebrating Hanukkah 8 days and not 7? By the way, Hanukkah was always celebrated for 8 days, and we find it even in Josephus, in earlier sources, where they don't mention the miracle of the jug of oil. Doesn't mean they didn't know about it, they just probably didn't see it as a significant event. There were so many other great victories and great miracles that happened there. But one of the ways to answer this question, it's a famous question, what's the 8-day miracle? If we take a look at the story of the jug of oil, it's supposed to be 7 days then. One of the ways to answer this question, which is my favorite one, is, you know what? Who told you you're going to find something? That itself is a miracle. And that miracle actually happened because they were searching, because there was such a strong desire to find that oil. They really were looking for that light. They literally were searching for it, and that's how they found it. Otherwise, there would be no Hanukkah. Otherwise, there would be no miracle, there would be no hope. And that is the essence of what Judaism is about. We always have hope. We never lose it. We always look at where is the light? Where can we find a source of light? And that's what makes us a civilization that outlasted all the other cultures and civilizations that I can possibly think about. Even if we take a look at the modern Greeks, they don't even share the same language with the ancient Greeks. And by the way, the ancient Greek and the ancient Greek culture, even though it was to a large extent in tremendous clash with Judaism and the Jewish culture, was at the same time very much respected by the rabbis, which actually brings us to another very interesting point. And that point is, what we take a look at the story of Hanukkah a little bit superficially, we think it's a cute little story of us being victorious in the war, of lightening that, light in the midst of darkness, lighting the menorah for 8 days. Actually, it has a very deep message. Besides the message of hope that we talk about, it also has a very deep message of what happens in that clash of civilizations. We usually think about it in terms of us, the Jews, versus them, the Greeks. But a bitter truth is that actually this was the first instance of what we can call today a civil war. Because if you take a look at the book of the Maccabees, if you take a look at what Josephus is writing, it becomes very clear and apparent that the war started with certain number of Hellenized Jews that demanded from the Greek authorities, that were residing in what today is Syria, they were called Seleucids, to build a gymnasium, a Greek school in Jerusalem. And of course, when you build a gymnasium in Jerusalem, you would follow all the Greek traditions. You would also be involved in Olympics, in playing Greek Olympic sports, and that would involve bringing sacrifices to the Greek gods. Absolute big no in Judaism and Jewish tradition. We do not believe in pagan worship, of course. And they would also be celebrating the nakedness of the physical bodies, which is also not something that we Jews are proud of. Even though physical body is a very important part of who we are, we don't necessarily want to show it off like the Greeks do. So there were many issues, and according to the book of the Maccabees, Greek authorities were not convinced, and they said, don't you have that group of, Orthodox Jews, that group of, fanatics, they're not going to be happy about this. And apparently, according to the account in the book of the Maccabees, this very affluent group of Jews that were quite wealthy and quite influential, they said, don't worry, we will take care of it. We know what we do. And that's how, with introduction of certain very foreign elements of Greek culture in Jerusalem, this became a culture war, Kulturkampf. This became a war of cultures in which, on both sides, actually, Jews were involved. So, this is a very deep story. And some of the elements of the story, as we can see, are very relevant today. I'd say the story of Hanukkah is not over yet. We're right in the midst of that story. And to figure it out and its significance of what the story is about, I'm inviting you to this very interesting journey to discover today what actually Hanukkah is about. So if we take a look at the Jewish attitude towards the Greek culture, we're actually going to see very mixed attitude. On one hand, there's a lot of fascination because Jews and Greeks are very similar in so many ways. We appreciate wisdom. We appreciate education. And for the first time in our history, we find another nation, another culture that is all about wisdom, that is all about education. That's, of course, the Greeks. And you'll be surprised, even in the works of Kabbalah, even in the book of Zohar, where the world is described, of course, in spiritual terms. So we are the kernel. We are the essence of the world, the Jewish people. And all the other nations, they're encircling us. They're encircling us. And who comes closest? What is the closest circle to the Jewish people? It's the Greeks. They are the closest. They actually have something very, very common with us. They have the desire to bring light into the world. But here comes a major, major difference. The light that Alexander the Great envisioned. And we know Alexander the Great, when he conquered the world, he didn't conquer the world just with a sword. He conquered the world with his desire to spread the Greek vision, the Greek culture, of the Greek vision of education, of enlightenment. But this had nothing to do with what we call spirituality. Greeks actually thought that the source of wisdom is here, in the head. You don't go above. You stay here in the head. That is the source, and that is the ultimate answer. And that's how we find the modern day descendants of the Greeks in each and every sphere of life that surrounds us today. We find so many elements of the Greek culture in the world around us today. They're not necessarily bad. As a matter of fact, as I said, in Judaism, we appreciate those elements. And we say they are very, very important. But we need to understand that according to the ancient blessing given to the two sons of Noah, One of them eventually is going to bring the Jewish people into the world, and the other is going to be the forefather of the Greeks. Shem, that's of course the name that represents Jewish civilization. We are Shemim, or Semitic people, descendants of Shem, right? So Shem in Hebrew means name. It's about the essence. It's about the understanding of the true essence of things. And the other brother, the brother of Shem that eventually is going to bring into the world, Yavan, the Greece. In Hebrew, Yavan is Greece. His name of the forefather is Yefet. Yefet could be interpreted in two different ways. The blessing given to Yefet is Yaft Elokim le-Yefet. God shall expand to Yefet. So Yefet is about expansion. Yefet is about growth. Yefet is about expansion and growth in physical terms. It wants to make it bigger. It wants to make it better. Yefet is about competition. Yefet is about growth in all possible ways, materialistically though, because that's what he primarily believes in. And that is an important part of blessing, but this is needs a spiritual essence so that Yefet doesn't take over the spiritual side. And when materialism is connected with the spiritual source, it could be a tremendous, unity. And it's a great vision. And that's the blessing given to Yefet. Yaft Elokim le-Yefet. God shall expand to Yefet. However, he shall dwell be'ohalei Shem. He shall dwell in the tents of Shem. In other words, that as long as the Greek culture, Greek civilization understands that its true blessing is coming from spirituality, that the true source of knowledge is coming from above, that a true source of expansion is coming from your connection with the source of everything, with the Almighty. These two, Yefet and Shem, Jews and the Greeks, can work together in a miraculous and marvelous ways. And that potentially is what's going to happen in the days of Messiah. That is hopefully the future. But of course the tragedy is when the external thinks that it has it all. When the external civilization, that civilization of Yefet, of expansion, of desire to grow primarily in material sphere, of desire to accomplish everything in just terms of empirics, something that I can follow in my sechel, in my mind, something that can be measured on physical terms, and there's nothing beyond that, proclaims Yefet. And then we come to a point of a serious conflict, of a clash of civilizations, which is exactly the story of Hanukkah. And we're going to find Jews on both sides of that clash. Some of the Jews are going to be Hellenized. They're going to be falling in love with the external aspects of the Greek culture. And of course, Yefet doesn't only mean expansion, cultural expansion. It also means Yofi, which is beauty. So we have all that civilization that preaches aesthetics, that brings into the world all sorts of aspects of beautiful culture, of music, of theater. Of course, Greeks were the ones who invented theater to begin with, and that beautiful, marvelous Greek architecture. All of these things, right? They're all poetic and beautiful and wonderful, but they need the inner feeling of Shem, which is searching for meaning and wants to connect it to the true source of everything. But that wasn't happening. And of course, Jews were so allured with the Greek culture that he would have a time at which the high priest in the temple would give himself a Greek name, Yason, Jason. That's according to the book of Maccabees. And right in the middle of a temple service, he would go down to the newly built stadium where he would be involved, believe it or not. It's hard to believe, but that's apparently the story in the book of Maccabees. He would be involved in playing in the Olympics, which of course would mean he would do that naked. And which of course would mean he would also bow down to Greek statues and bring sacrifices to those pagan gods. That's how deep was the conflict, and it really touched the very core and very essence of the Jewish people. So at that point, some Jews said enough is enough. And there was a small group of Jewish partisans that went into a place known as Modi'in, and they started those attacks on the Greek soldiers. And eventually Seleucids, Greek Assyrians, would bring regular army to deal with it, and they would fail and fail again. And at some point, finally, the temple and Jerusalem will be liberated and restored to its former glory. And as I said, throughout centuries, initially this was the holiday of Jewish sovereignty, and this was a holiday and celebration of rededication of the temple. However, my friends, after we lost both the sovereignty and the temple, it became a holiday primarily associated with otherwise minuscule, small events of lighting that oil of one jug that lasted for 8 full days. And here we come to another very interesting mystical insight coming from Maharal, one of our great Jewish mystics. Maharal, of course, uses here Jewish numerology, and it says if you take a look at the numeric value of Heichal, Heichal in Hebrew is the temple, but not the innermost part of the temple, which is Holy of Holies, rather that part of the temple where you would have the menorah. And that's what Greeks defiled. So Heichal is 65. When you take a look at Gematria numeric value of Heichal, it's 65. However, Yevan, which is Greece, is 66. In other words, says Maharal, they do have that power with their desire to ask all those logical questions, with their inquiry, with the power of their mind and intellect that they can overcome the holiness of Heichal. And that's how menorah, which actually, ironically, in Jewish tradition also symbolically represents the wisdom. And it's specifically the menorah that Greeks, who are the masters of wisdom, they were seeking to destroy. By the way, they didn't destroy anything physically. They had no problem with the structure. They appreciate the beauty. They had a problem with the concept that is a source of wisdom that goes beyond the intellect. And that's how they challenged the menorah. And that's how they decided to extinguish the menorah. Because menorah in the Greek culture and civilization should only exist as a temple of light, of enlightenment of my human intellect. And if we perceive the light as something that is miraculously given to us by God, and we are being enlightened by Him in all sorts of ways, this is something that Greeks do not appreciate and don't like. And that's how they challenged this specific aspect. However, of course, we have the Holy of Holies, which Greek could not touch. And in the Holy of Holies, we have the Torah. We have the Ark. And we have the tablets of the law. And that represents the innermost connection that we have with the source of wisdom. And that's what we're doing right now, studying Torah. And those who just joined us, I'm reminding you that this special session is dedicated to Refuah Shlema, speedy recovery of Leah Chaya Bas Chava. Let us all wish her speedy recovery, please God. So, that innermost center of what Jewish tradition represents, that innermost connection of the Holy of Holies, that is something that remained sacred, and the Greeks could not touch it. And that's how we won that war. We won that war not because we were numerous, not because we were powerful or strong, not because we had some sort of a military strategy that the Greeks didn't. It's because we had that connection, we had that desire to rededicate the temple, to bring the purity of the light of menorah back into the world. And that's how that war was won. And later on, of course, throughout the generations, when the descendants of the Maccabees would fall victim to the desire of grabbing power, of becoming materialistic, of becoming basically involved in all sorts of petty politics. And that's how they started fighting each other. And that's how they themselves brought Romans to come and conquer the land. The idea of sovereignty, and even the idea of the temple that was at that point destroyed, also for us being too materialistic and us being not connected with God, finally brought into the light another miracle which stays with us throughout the generations. And that's the miracle of the jug of oil. So, looking back at the fact that the jug of oil is there for 8 days, we already made one connection saying that 8 is a number of supernatural. And of course, again, it's highlighting this very distinct understanding of Judaism and Jewish tradition that even in the smallest events in life, we are looking for the source of connection with God, which is actually a miracle. So where do we find miracle? We find it pretty much everywhere. And for that matter, even after the Hanukkah is over, we can continue bringing that connection and that light into our life on a daily basis. And that's probably something we should do. You know, in the Talmud, there's a dispute. There's two opinions in the Talmud as to in what order we should lit the menorah. According to the school of Shammai, we start with 8 and we decrease, go down 7, 6, 5. I'm not going to explain that opinion, but the opinion of Hillel, which we follow, says that we increase the miracle because that's exactly what we want to do. We want to feel the presence of the miracle in our life on a daily basis, and it increases because each and every day we search for light. And that's how the miracle started on the first day. They were searching for that light. And that's how they found the jug of oil. So if we take a look at some practical lessons for us today of Hanukkah, first of all, of course, I'd say the source of the miracle is that inner fire, which every Jew has in its soul. We all have that inner fire. And that is the source, my friends, of this very beautiful Jewish understanding that we never despair, and we always hopeful, and we always know that despite the fact that there's so much darkness in the world, light will overcome darkness. If you take a look at all the ancient civilizations of the past that surrounded us, they're no more. And we are still around, and we're young and fresh, and we have thriving state of Israel today. And the Jewish sovereignty to a large extent has been restored, which, by the way, gives an additional meaning to the story of Hanukkah. We are back to that understanding again, because now we can appreciate sovereignty too. And hopefully very soon, the temple will be rebuilt. And that will be the culmination of the true understanding of what Hanukkah essentially is. And it's going to bring the light into the whole world. So we are here to bring more and more light. And what's the source of light? It's our heart. It's our inner light. That's how they found that light in the temple. They were searching for it. They were looking for that light. And that's the only reason how they found it. So here today, when we're in the midst of pandemic, when we sometimes feel desperate, we feel insecure, we feel maybe depressed, we have to remember that great lesson. The light is there. The light is constantly there. It's right in our heart. We just need to breathe in the blessings that Hashem has given us every day, and breathe out all the sorrow and the tragedy, and remind ourselves that we have that source of light right here, right in our heart. That's number one. Number two, we increase the presence of light. We start from 1. The second day we have 2. The third day we have 3. Then we have 4. And all the way to 8. And 8 is a number of miracle, because 7 is number of completeness within nature. We have 7 days of the week. We have 6, which is the material number. And 7th, of course, is the Shabbat, is the holy. So material and the spiritual together in its completeness equals 7. 7 days of the week. That's a cycle of 7, cycle of nature. However, 8 goes beyond that. And that's how circumcision is on the 8th day. Because again, this is something that Greek would not understand. And this is something that is essentially Jewish. Seeking that connection, celebrating that connection, recognizing that connection with the supernatural that is here and now, in every instant, every second of our life. And we are to grow, and we are to increase the presence of the light, much like it happens throughout the Hanukkah. It should happen, please God, in our life on a daily basis. And finally, I think the very last message of Hanukkah is we should keep hoping. Again, Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory says, if Greeks brought to the world this idea and understanding of tragedy is the major genre of Greek literature, and the belief that everything is predestined, we did the opposite. We brought into the world the idea of free will. We are the masters of everything that happens in the world, in the sense that God gave us free will. And He imbued us with His own spirit when He created us. And He gave us this distinction between what good is and what evil is, so that we can make good choices in our life. So we can make good choices and hopefully make this world a better place. And that's how we make mitzvot. That's how we make this world a better place. By each and every act of being committed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, being committed to Hashem, and adding more of His presence into this world, and adding more of His light into this world. And so we cannot despair. And we are, as opposed to the Greeks who brought tragedy into the world, an idea of fate into the world, we brought the idea of free will, an idea of hope. And hope is a very Jewish idea. And the reason we have that hope is because we know that Hashem wants the best for us. And right in the midst of the darkness, we're going to search for light. And much like our ancestors in the ancient days, The Maccabees, they found that light because they did not despair. So too, we are called to find that light right now, right in the world where we have pretty much the same challenge. We have the challenge of materialism. We have the challenge of the world around us, which is much like the Greeks. It's all about success. It's all about being defined by material terms. It's all about just expanding and not even thinking and caring about what essentially is good. We are being challenged much in the same way. But today, my friends, when we light the menorah this year, let us think and reflect upon these three things. The inner fire we have in our heart, which Hashem gave us. The source of the blessing is HaKadosh Baruch Hu creating us in His image. The growth that we're going to expand the presence of Hashem by bringing more light into the world on a daily basis. And finally, hope. We're not allowed to fall into despair, no matter where we are. You know, Rav Nachman of Breslov said, the biggest of all mistakes, sins, I wouldn't use the word sin, I would use the word mistake, that a person can make is to fall into despair. Because when he falls into despair, he doesn't see the light. He doesn't see that he has Hashem with him. So we are not allowed to do that. We are supposed to follow the Maccabees and keep on searching for light, and we're definitely going to find it. And so this is going to be my blessing to everyone present here, that please God, first of all, we had this Torah session dedicated to Refuah Shlema, to speedy recovery of Leah, Chaya, Bas Chava. That's number one. Number two, I would encourage you to think as you light the menorah about the presence of God in the world, about bringing more light into the world. And every mitzvah, every good deed is changing the world and making it a better place. And I hope that's what we did just now. And finally, number three, if you'd like to dedicate our future Torah sessions to a particular good cause, this could be anything from Refuah Shlema, speedy recovery to somebody, dedicating to Neshama, dedicating to those souls of your friends or relatives, or dedicated to someone's success in a particular endeavor. You know, Torah study has a particular power, a particular ability to help us grow and to give us merits. And I would encourage all of you to keep on and to bring more light into the world. And if you'd like to support us, you're welcome to do it. You know where to find me, and you know how we can connect. Happy Hanukkah to all of you, please God. This year, despite so much darkness around us, we're going to light the fire of the menorah, and we're going to bring more light into the world. Happy Hanukkah.